Experts say Beijing is lying. The question is, by how much? Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
Good to see you again.
You too.
So we're going to talk about China today.
We are going to talk about China. There is a series of stories that I've been noticing over the last 3 or 4 months that have been a range of experts within China, but also from the United States, have been questioning what is the real rate of economic growth in China. We're going to go through 3 independent sources, 3 independent experts who've said that the actual number of economic growth in China is a lot less compared to what Beijing says it is, but also what the IMF says, because the IMF have effectively accepted the Beijing number to a large degree. And we then want to talk about some implications about Australia, because one of the things I was looking for in the recent federal budget was what was the assumption on GDP growth for China, and Australia has effectively accepted Beijing's numbers. So if these experts are correct in that Beijing's has exaggerated its rate of economic growth, that has massive implications for the federal budget, and that has massive implications for the Australian economy going forward into more dicier circumstances.
Right, because of course we're so reliant on China as effectively the people who buy most of our stuff, particularly iron ore and coal and those sorts of things. And presumably if their economic state is actually less positive, that would mean their demand probably will be less going forward. And that could be very significant.
Correct. So China is our biggest investment partner, but also our biggest trade partner. So yes, so minerals and agriculture are very big sectors, but also I would say education as well as tourism. There's some very big sectors where we rely heavily on China, and obviously in terms of investment. Now, when we think about the property bubble, one of the sources of activity, particularly around construction, that has helped fuel the bubble, particularly in the 2013, 14, 15 period, was foreign Chinese investment, both in commercial as well as residential investment. So now there's that point. The other point is that the last time we had the GFC, China was launched the biggest stimulus package in the world, and it was that uptick in economic growth in China back then, and the capacity to do so was critical for Australia not to go into recession. So in the debate with Christopher Joy, he said if we have a global recession, all bets are off. And I think one of the reasons why we can say that all bets are off and that we will face an Armageddon is because we won't have China to save us like they did last time.
Okay, pretty significant. So where do we start the conversation then?
Sure. So now, where we're going to start is so the IMF has been making some recent statements about GDP growth in China. So I'm going to read a quote. This is from CNBC, report on CNBC, 10th of April, 2019. The forecast was IMF raises its 2019 growth forecast for China. The IMF said in its latest World Economic Outlook report that China is projected to grow by 6.3% this year, higher than the fund's previous forecast of 6.2%. However, the fund downgraded China's economic growth for 2020 to 6.1% from its previous projection of 6.2%. So just to take a step back, last year, the Chinese said that they grew at 6.6% for 2018. This was the lowest rate of growth in about 28, 29 years in terms of China. So it was a very big story. We now have the IMF saying that that they were going to grow slower than 2018, but also Beijing itself said that they were likely to grow in the 6 to 6.5% range for 2019, which is slower than what they did in 2018. And obviously the expectation is there'll be even slower growth going into 2020. So, so there's clear evidence that the Chinese economy is slowing. This is something that Beijing is willing to openly admit. The IMF is also forecasting that. Now, there was some stimulus packages, particularly fiscal stimulus, launched earlier this year. And so the IMF has now revised their number up for 2019 growth. And China came out in the last week or so and said that growth for annualized growth, for the March quarter was about 6.4, and they were on target to meet this around between 6.3 to 6.5% economic growth for 2019. So we basically have effective consensus between sort of the global bodies like the IMF and Beijing that it's going to be roughly around that region.
And it's worth noting that in that last conversation that they had about it, they highlighted the importance of the household sector in China and the property sector in China as two very important levers for growth.
Yes.
Relative to some of the other sectors like construction, for example.
Yeah. So we definitely have seen the household sector in China. They have been leveraging up, whereas historically Chinese households have been significant savers. At least 50% of their saving, 50% of the income has been saved. So now they're like really leveraging up, because the other forms of growth. Or the other forms where they could increase debt were largely sort of exhausted, and now the sense of households, well, you need to get into debt so we can keep the Chinese debt bubble going. So yeah, Martin. So obviously, one of the important points to make is that when Harry Dent has come to Australia, Harry has said that the biggest bubble in the world is the Chinese bubble. Over the last 20 years, the Chinese have expanded the amount of debt, particularly in the financial system, by about $40 trillion in terms of measured in US dollars. So, now, and obviously the Reserve Bank, our Reserve Bank has, in the last 2 or 3 years, has warned about a potential shock coming from China. So if there is to be a shock, global shock, there is some views about maybe Europe, maybe the United States, but there is a lot of focus in terms of what's happening in China, because obviously we have more direct links now because of the way the global economy has now changed. We have more direct links to what's happening in China, and that does affect us.
And I guess it's worth saying that the information processes and mechanisms in China may not be precisely the same as in Western countries, right? And there may be more control around some of the data flows for obvious reasons. So therefore the question is the data accurate, right, appropriate, or not?
Yes. So there's always a question of measurement, the methodology, but is there a deliberate attempt to overinflate the number for political purposes? And some of these sources, say, imply that. Now, when you look at total debt in the Chinese economy, is it about, the Financial Times of London reported last year was around 300%. Now, if actual GDP is a lot lower than what Beijing says it is, well, the quantum of debt and therefore the quantum of risk in the Chinese economy is substantially larger than what the Chinese people believe, but also what Australians believe, and that obviously has significant risks in terms of the ordinary household, because when they're thinking about how risky is my job, how risky is sort of my mortgage, no one's really thinking, and the Australian press has failed to really communicate what are the risks to households coming from China, particularly if the Chinese are lying about the state of their own economy.
Okay, so let's look at those sources then who are saying actually those numbers may not be right.
Okay, Martin. So where we're going to start is we're going to start with Zero Hedge, 5th of January 2019. So the title of the article is Chinese professor censored after admitting real GDP growth is below 2%. There are voices in China who are ethnic Chinese. There are voices in China who are sort of Western, who are expressing some of these views. So I was somewhat surprised when I saw this article that given the level of censorship and when the social credit score and the potential ramifications for individuals to be critical of the regime, that this economics professor went on the record. And let me just quote what the Zero Hedge story says. So, quote, to the consternation of Chinese censors, a presentation delivered by an economics professor at Renmin University in Beijing sparked a controversy last month when the professor claimed that a secret government research group had estimated Chinese growth in gross domestic product could be as low as 1.67% in 2018, far below the official rate. Now, the official rate was 6.6. Here we have an economics professor saying that there is a secret statistical unit in the government saying it's like 1 2/3%. So now, if that's the real number, that has massive implications for in terms of what's the real state of the economy, but also because there's a level of confidence that people have in making investment decisions and allocating capital. If the real number, just say tomorrow the real number came out and it was less than 2%, a lot of people would be shocked and basically say, confidence would just go through the floor. So obviously, there's definitely an economic and political incentive to inflate the number. But and now some people just obviously dispute this, but here is a claim by a particular professor. So that was obviously source number one. Source number two is. There was a report done by the Brookings Institute, which is a US-based think tank, and they released a report in March of this year, and the title of the paper is "A Forensic Examination of China's National Accounts," and the quote is, "Relative to the official numbers, we estimate that GDP growth from 2008 to 2016 is 1.7% percentage points lower, and the investment and savings rate in 2016 is 7 percentage points lower." So people can look up this report from the Brookings Institute, and they've basically said that you look at this 8-year period from 2008 to 2016, and you're looking at about nearly 1.7% growth lower. So and this is more, not that there's a political conspiracy. It is more about the way the sort of methodologies and data collections techniques that the Chinese government uses. The Brookings Institute basically has been very critical of those techniques, and said no, the actual number is lower, and therefore the actual size of the Chinese economy is far lower than what China claims. And one of the conclusions that the institute came to was that the US economy is still the largest economy in the world, and by a reasonable factor, because China has been basically relying on its GDP number.
So, John, why does the Brookings Institute believe the number is lower then?
So now, on that point, there's a critical paragraph that the Brookings Institute tries to explain. So here's the quote. "On the production side, the discrepancy between local and aggregate GDP is entirely driven by the gap between local and national estimates of industrial output. On the expenditure side, the gap is in investment. Local statistics increasingly misrepresent the two numbers after 2008, but there is no corresponding change in the adjustment made by the National Bureau of Statistics." Now, one of the key things that has been happening in Beijing is because the local councils or the local governments, they all report to the national government. They all have KPIs that they have to meet to show Beijing that they're actually performing well, and one of the things that they have to deliver is a certain rate of economic growth in their local province. So obviously there is an incentive for local governments and local mayors to inflate their numbers. And one of the things that we covered last year in one of our posts on DFA was about the use of off-balance sheet techniques to hide massive quantities of debt in the local Chinese government sector. So here again is another claim that the local government sector in China has been basically rigging the statistics, largely because they want to meet the KPIs set by the national government. But and one of the consequences of that is we have a high rate of national economic growth in China than what the Brookings Institute believes is the case.
So we've got a Chinese-based professor saying it. We've got US analysts saying it.
Yes.
Who else is saying it?
Yes. Now the third source is we have an American. Not ethnic Chinese, so Western American, who's an academic in China. So he's actually in China now. He came out with his own study, and this was reported in the South China Morning Post on the 10th of March. So the title of the article was "China's GDP could be half of the reported number. The government is accused of perpetuating the existence of zombie companies by granting loss-making companies loans. Banks, in turn, treat these companies as creditworthy, whereas in reality they should be written off as bad debt." And so the Economist is a U.S. economist, Michael Pettis from Peking University, and the quote goes on: "If you believe there is bad debt that has not been sufficiently written down, you must believe that China's GDP is overstated relative to what it would be in any other country. That must be true. If we are able to calculate GDP correctly, it would probably be half of the recorded number." So again, in this case, this professor is saying that the way debt and creditworthiness of certain companies treated is done not consistent with international accounting conventions, and therefore there's a lot more bad debt in the system that's being hidden, covered up, and that's basically driving the level of economic growth to in this professor's assessment to be double what the real number is. So if we're talking about 6.5% in terms of GDP for 2019, this professor is saying it's probably about 3.25%. So now these stories, in my view, are very significant, because if the real number is anywhere near what these three independent sources say, what that will do to confidence, that what they'll do to financial markets, if it was ever exposed to be the case, it would have significant impacts, which would impact our economy. It would sort of be a bit of a global shock. It would be that shock that we've been sort of talking about. As Christopher Joyce said, all bets would be off. And just like you've said on 7:30, but also on other channels, about we could see 20-30% declines, independent of something international happening. But if the international thing happens, it could be deeper. Well, China is one of those sources where it could be deeper, and we have basically a few people on the record saying that the situation in China is far worse than what the Chinese in the IMF are willing to openly concede.
Okay, so it's not definitively proved one or the other, but these questions are pretty significant questions being asked, right? And as you say, the consequences could be quite significant if, in fact, the true growth in China is slower.
Yes. Well, the thing is, like, so we have three independent people saying the Chinese number isn't what the national government says it is. Is that definitive proof? Potentially not. But given the record of the Chinese government being honest, open, and transparent and accountable, I would place more weight on these three claims that the number is overinflated than accept at face value what the Chinese government is actually admitting to.
So what's the implication then for the Australian federal budget?
Well, indeed. Now the thing is that we had a projection of a surplus for next financial year 2019-20, and we had surpluses as far as the eye can see, that they'll be able to pay off all of the net government debt that has been accumulated since 2008. Maybe for a future post we can look at some of the other assumptions, but also on the expenditure side around revenues and expenditure, about how, in my view, fraudulent the budget is. And I've actually in the week after the budget was delivered, I spoke to two coalition MPs, and I said, your government committed mass fraud. And they were shocked by that, and they said, well, what do you mean? I said, here's a whole host of examples of these assumptions that clearly are clearly not conservative. They have been overblown, and your level of revenue, particularly on the revenue side, it's likely to be a lot less than what the government claims to be. Now, one of those assumptions I pointed to these backbench MPs, what was this particular Chinese number. So we actually have the international GDP growth forecast, which was in the budget, which is table 2 in budget paper 1. So the international forecast. So you look at China, 6.6, and the budget assumes 6.6 for 2019, 2020. And 5.75% for 2021. So, the budget is assuming slower growth in China. Now, we have the IMF and the Chinese government saying that 2019 is going to be above 6. So you may say that maybe on according to the official numbers, Australia was a little bit more conservative, but these three independent studies say that no, even at 6% for 2019, this is an overinflated number. So it is likely that the forecasts around international growth Chinese growth, how this will impact, the terms of trade, how this will impact investment flows, trade flows, but also in terms of the risks, because if these studies are true, the quantum of systemic risk in China is far higher than what maybe the budget is willing to assume, and we could see revenue go through the floor, just like it did in the GFC.
All right, so there are extra risks then that people need to consider.
Yes.
And as you say, one of the risks is, what if China is not correct?
Yep. And obviously the ultimate conclusion is that if you, going into the battle box the next few weeks, if you are voting for one side or another on the basis that you may think that one side of politics may deliver a surplus, well, one of the key numbers that they are hinging on this surplus is this growth number, which a whole range of experts in China, but also outside of China, is saying it's fake. And if the Morrison government delivered a fair dinkum budget, they would have conceded in their papers that we're not going to accept the Beijing/IMF number, and we're actually going to come up with something a little bit more realistic, and actually have a realistic and very conservative budget in terms of assumptions. But no, they've gone with the overinflated assumption, and that has implications as to how much revenue, tax revenue, the government is likely to generate over the next decade, in which they claim they'll be able to pay off all of the net government debt that has been accumulated since the GFC.
And I suppose they could, the plausible deniability, say, well, the IMF said it, so we must be okay.
Well, the thing is, it seems that it's the standard operating procedure of Canberra as well as Martin Place. It's a plausible deniability, as long as they can point to some international organisation, no matter how credible they are, no matter their track record, they will just say, well, these people said it, even though, as Eddie Hobbs said, the IMF gave the Irish the clean bill of health. And even in the last week, Frydenberg has been texting about S&P and Fitch giving the AAA. Well, what happened with these rating agencies in the lead up to the GFC with rating mortgage-backed securities in the US market? And a lot of these international institutions should be ignored by our officials, and we should actually tell the Australian people the real situation and plan our budgets accordingly.
John, I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there you have it. A very important message, questioning perhaps China's growth statistics. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.